In 1306, Edward the First of England was, yet again, preparing to wage war on Scotland. Before the king headed north, he knighted scores of young noblemen in a spectacular ceremony at Westminster. The total of new knights was given at 300, according to a chronicler who was in attendance. The most prominent young man to be knighted was Prince Edward, heir to the throne, who had recently turned 22. The ceremony created great excitement amongst the public, and sadly did not go without a hitch, as two men were crushed to death by the huge crowds, with others being taken ill. Nonetheless, it was still a grand occasion, which became known as the Feast of the Swans, with two swans being brought before the king at the celebration feast. There, Edward the First declared that he would once again wage war on Robert the Bruce and the Scots. Prince Edward, as he had done before, would join his father on his Scottish campaign. Among the knights that had been knighted alongside Prince Edward was a young man named Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh's father, another Hugh, known as the Elder, to differentiate between he and his son, had served Edward the First in earlier campaigns in Scotland, and the younger Hugh was just beginning to come to prominence at the time of his knighting, making a good marriage soon after the Feast of the Swans. Over time, Hugh would develop a close relationship with Prince Edward, which only grew after Edward had become king. For the time being, however, the prince's attention was directed mainly towards Piers Gaveston. Edward the First died in July 1307, famously at Burr-on-Sands, on his way, despite his failing health, to wage war yet again on the Scots. His son now became King Edward II, and in the early years of the new reign, it was clear that Edward II was still susceptible to the influence of Piers Gaveston. Indeed, Edward I had been furious to discover the extent of Piers's hold over his son, and he banished Piers from the royal court. But with the old king now dead, Edward II was free to do as he pleased. Even from the very outset of the reign, it was clear that trouble was not far away. At the royal coronation in early 1308, the exceptionally arrogant Piers played a far too prominent role, casting a shadow over Edward's young queen Isabella, the daughter of the French king Philip IV. Despite Piers being banished a further two times by the nobility, whose hatred of Gaveston intensified rapidly, Edward refused to forget Piers, and he would be recalled. Assured of the king's favour, Pierce's obnoxiousness continued to grow, giving his enemies charming nicknames such as Burst Belly. Eventually, Pierce pushed his luck too far, and he was executed by the nobles, led by the Earls of Warwick and Lancaster. What happened to Gaveston should have been a stark warning to Edward II and anyone else that he happened to be fond of. But it was a lesson that was not given the respect it required. After Gaveston's demise, Edward quickly found a new favourite, which came in the shape of Hugh Despenser the Younger, who was described by the Lanercost Chronicle as being the apple in the king's eye, and it was Hugh who was by the king's side during his greatest humiliation. Attempting to follow in his father's footsteps, Edward waged war in Scotland, but in 1314 the hapless king was routed at the Battle of Bannockburn. Refused refuge in Stirling Castle by the English constable, Edward, with Hugh close at hand, had to rely on the knowledge of a Scottish knight in English service to find an escape route to Dunbar Castle. All the while, Edward and Hugh were tracked by James the Black Douglas, one of the greatest and most fearsome knights of the medieval period. The ominous sound of Scottish hooves in hot pursuit must have been terrifying for Edward, but Hugh, if he was anything like Piers, may well have offered the king soothing words, at least when they had reached a place of safety. In such a crisis, a bond between the two had formed, or at least Edward had grown fond of Hugh. It may be assumed that Hugh was simply using Edward for his own means. Backdrop: it is understandable how Edward came to love Hugh like a brother. Bannockburn was a spectacular humiliation for Edward, and one of the worst for any English king in medieval history. The king, a sensitive sort, had to look for comfort where he could find it, and as he rode away to Dunbar, it was Hugh he could see over his shoulder. For Hugh's part, this was clever in the extreme. As things turned sour quickly for the king, Hugh calculated that Edward would need a friend, and he made sure it would be to him who the king could turn to. And Hugh also benefited in a more material sense from the disaster at Bannockburn. His brother in law, Gilbert de Clare, had fallen in the battle, and some of Gilbert's lands, most notably Glamorgan in Wales, came into Hugh's possession, making him very wealthy. But the nobility, having lived through the Gaveston days, could already see what was happening and turned against Hugh almost immediately, removing him from the king's council. This wouldn't be the last time that happened either. Over the coming years, the situation in England deteriorated at an alarming rate, as Edward II made a total pig's ear of his kingship. Hugh, with his lordship of Glamorgan, began throwing his weight around with the Welsh marcher lords, accusing them of treason, and unquestionably hoping to use his hold over the king to enrich himself further. Whether it was justifiable or even legal was of little consequence to this most brazen of upstarts. Understandably, the nobles were furious at Edward, and it was clear that civil war was not far away. And even Edward realised this, and he felt it necessary that he keep Hugh close at hand, lest history should repeat itself, and Hugh go the same way as Piers Gaveston. So dangerous had the situation become that Hugh was ordered by the king to take to ship until it was safe for him to return. Whilst at sea, Hugh remarkably turned to piracy in order to quench his thirst for money and riches, attacking merchant ships, killing crews, and stealing their loot. Meanwhile, back on land, Edward began to get the best of his nobles, imprisoning Roger Mortimer in the Tower of London and having Thomas Earl of Lancaster executed. Lancaster had been defeated at Boroughbridge, captured, and put on trial before the king, and both Despensers, who had now both returned to the king's side. Thomas was refused the right to speak in his own defence, as he had done with Piers a decade before, and so the Earl's fate was sealed. May have felt jubilant at the demise of a man who was clearly a threat to their corrupt regime, but their joy was misplaced. As these events were going on, little did they realise that someone closer to home was becoming increasingly isolated, disillusioned, and disgusted by the situation. For a time, the marriage between Queen Isabella and Edward II had been reasonably happy, with Isabella tolerating Edward's shortcomings, if not quite understanding them. She had done her queenly duty, giving Edward children, including his successor, the future Edward III, but things had gone too far now. Gaveston had been one thing, with Isabella being young at the time, but for Edward to devote his attention to a second favourite, casting his queen into the shadows, was one insult too many. As far as Isabella was concerned, someone, namely Hugh, had come in between the relationship between her and her husband, and things would have to change. When she was sent on a diplomatic mission to the court of the King of France, Charles IV, her brother, Isabella was given exactly the opportunity she had been waiting for. Joined by her son, the soon to be Edward III, and Roger Mortimer, who had escaped from the Tower of London, Isabella, alienated beyond repair, began to plot the downfall of Hugh Despenser the younger, and ultimately her husband. Edward had pleaded with his wife and son to return to him, but soon bitterly realised that reconciliation was out of the question. On hearing of an army led by Isabella and Mortimer landing in England, Edward and Hugh fled towards Wales, with Hugh's father holed up at Bristol. It wasn't long before Hugh the Elder fell into the Queen's grasp, and he was brutally executed. For Hugh the Younger, a similar fate lay in store, as he and the King were found cowering in a Welsh abbey near Neath. Hugh's fate was inevitable, his trial at Hereford a complete sham. Hugh was ordered to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. With the Queen watching on, he was hanged till half dead, revived, disemboweled, with his organs burned on a fire before him, and his genitals hacked off. He was then beheaded and cut into four pieces. For Edward II, his fate too was sealed, though less bloody and more mysterious. Thus came about the end of Hugh Despenser the Younger. He would have been well advised to pay closer attention to the recent past and the fate of Piers Gaveston, but in Hugh's case, his greed had got the better of him. England had been in no mood for a second Piers Gaveston, and it seemed inevitable that Hugh was doomed to die violently. Yet with a little more moderation, he, like Piers and Edward II himself, could have saved his own life. However, it seems Hugh was incapable of moderation.